Welcome back. We are beginning the second part of our presentation on cultural studies with an actual definition of cultural studies. So let's get right to it. Jonathan Culler, in his book Literary Theory, very short introduction, describes it this way. A critical field that seeks to demystify and understand the functioning of a culture, particularly in the modern world. How cultural productions work and how cultural identities are constructed and organized for individuals and groups. Okay. I think the two key words here are demystify and understand. What this means essentially is, Culler's operating from the assumption that culture is mysterious. Its operations are opaque or tenebrous, cloaked in shadow. So the job of a cultural studies critic is to unpack these complex systems and understand how they work, particularly how they go about constructing and organizing identities, both for individuals, so how you come to think of yourself as an individual, and how you come to think of yourself as a part of the various groups that you are a part of. The general goals of cultural studies bring heightened attention to the beliefs and practices implicitly enforced by particular literary acts of praising and blaming. So here we have that word, that phrase, beliefs and practices, again, implicitly. These beliefs and practices are being enforced without drawing particular attention to the fact they are. And the means by which it happens is praising and blaming, and we're going to get into that in a couple of minutes. Also, understand the multiple ways in which identities are formed, experienced, and transmitted, which again is coming from Culler. So the idea of identity, how it's made, how you experience yourself as yourself, and how that sense of identity of you or your group is transmitted or communicated to other people. Identities, again, can include individual and group identities. Groups can be defined by race, gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity, religion, education, economics, region, nation, political affiliation, and so on. There's hundreds of ways in which you can define a group. And it can also be defined by your sense of your belonging or exclusion, your sense of identification with any of the above. So that's a way in which your identity would be formed. So how do texts work in culture? By implicitly enforcing beliefs and practices. We talked about that a second ago. Enforcing means they're saying, this is what you must do. Cultural texts do this work implicitly. They basically are doing it, they're just not calling attention to the fact that they're conditioning how you should believe and how you should act. How do they do this? They articulate cultural codes of behavior. So how should you act? By active and passive process of acculturation. Actively is directly modeling, do this, do this, do this. Passively is showing it in ways that are attractive or showing a particular behavior in ways that are negative or frightening, but never commenting on it. So it happens both ways. The much more powerful effect is when it's done passively, because people can resist something that they're actively told to do, but if it's passive, it's just sort of there, and it's just sort of right, it's just sort of the way it happens, and if it happens a lot, then you just sort of come to accept it, and before you know it, you're doing something, didn't even know you're doing it. Texts not only reflect culture, but help to shape, articulate, and reproduce codes, beliefs, and practices. So they reflect what happens, but they also condition it. So they say, this is the way people act, but by showing the way people act, they're also helping to perpetuate that way of acting or that way of thinking. So here we're looking at Juliet, taken from the web. Variety of images from all sorts of different websites. What I'd like you to do is pause the video right here, look at these different visuals, and then when you're ready, go ahead and hit play again. And we're going to move on to our next slide where you're going to get another series of visuals of Juliet. Study that one, and then once you're ready, hit play again. And that's going to take you to some questions that I'm going to have you attempt to answer. Okay, now that you've looked at those things, and you can always go back and look at them again, I'm going to have you do some application kinds of questions. So again, you're going to be doing some writing for me on these things. First question is kind of a three-part question. What beliefs about beauty are implicitly enforced by these images? These images aren't saying this is what beauty is, but they are implicitly suggesting ideas about beauty. what beliefs about femininity are implicitly enforced by these images, and what beliefs about Juliet herself are implicitly enforced by these images. What codes of behavior are being articulated? And that's hard because they're not actually doing anything, these visuals, but there are ways of behaving that are being articulated by these different individuals and by the individuals as a group. How might these images reflect cultural codes of behavior? There's a quote mark missing right there. And how might they help to shape, articulate, and reproduce those codes, beliefs, and practices? And there's a question mark missing there. There's no right or wrong answer to these. It's just I want you to work with these ideas for a little bit. Again, I'm going to shut up for a second so you can pause here, and then we're going to move on. So now that we've done that, I'm going to move on and give you another set of questions that you can ask about text and culture, and then we'll do some applications with that. Okay, how do texts work in culture 2? One way that you can address this is to ask how those texts enforce, articulate, reflect, and shape beliefs, practices, and codes. So you praise and blame. So you show something as positive, as praiseworthy, or something as negative or blameworthy. And you do this either explicitly or implicitly through censure or through celebration or through presenting something in a negative context or a positive context. Through containment and exclusion. So you can wall an idea or an act off and present it as odd or outside the norm. So okay, it's there, but it's weird but harmless. Or exclusion, you can actually chuck it out. This is unacceptable behavior. Exclusion can happen for ideas, it can happen for people, obviously. Reinforcement. You can't do it just once. If you do it just once, it's a one-off. If it happens multiple times in multiple contexts, then it's a much more powerful way of shaping. These processes of praising and blaming, containing, excluding, or reinforcing are often passive, indirect, or implied, rather than asserted outright. Again, they're much more powerful if it's a passive process than an active, explicit one. Okay, here we have a still from the film Avatar from 20th Century Fox. I am assuming that most of you are familiar with Avatar. That's kind of a risky assumption. I know not everybody has seen every movie of all time, so this one was pretty popular. Most people are aware of it. So, if you are familiar with the movie Avatar, here are some questions for you to ask yourself. How does it use praise to endorse, articulate, reflect, or shape beliefs? And remember, this praise may be implicit, passive, indirect, or implied. How does Avatar use blame to endorse, articulate, reflect, or shape practices? So how does it use praise to promote beliefs? How does it use blame to promote practices? How does Avatar use exclusion to endorse, articulate, reflect, or shape beliefs? So who is excluded? Why? How are they excluded? What form does the exclusion take? Is that individual ever allowed back in? Under what circumstances? Take a few minutes to answer these questions to the best of your ability. If you have never seen Avatar, that's okay. Just swap in a movie or TV show with which you are familiar. Do a little brief explanation, a little summary like I did for you of what's going on with your movie or your show just to familiarize me with it. And then go ahead and just drop in the name of your thing where I have put Avatar, and you can answer these questions just as well as the other people. I'll shut up for a second to let you pause it, and then we will continue on. How to do cultural studies. You do that by asking questions. These are the questions that I've actually been asking you up to this point. What kinds of behaviors, what modes of practice does this work seem to enforce? What might readers at a particular time and place find compelling? Are there differences between my values and the values implicit in the work I am reading? Upon what social understanding does the work depend? Whose freedom of thought or movement might be constrained implicitly or explicitly by this work? Whose freedom might be encouraged or expanded? That's the one question on here that doesn't come from Greenblatt. And I was looking at it and thinking, yeah, you can constrain, but you can also encourage or expand. And so I've added that question there. What are the larger social structures with which these particular acts of praise or blame might be connected? That's really all cultural studies is. It's just asking questions like these about any particular text that you might encounter. They're not the only questions I can ask, but they're a good starting place. So take a moment to jot those down, and any questions you might have about those questions, what they're getting at, and we can discuss those when we meet together again as a class. And that's it for our introduction to cultural studies. It's a complex field. It's a very rewarding one. You can work with it really your entire life and never get to the end of the thing because it's constantly growing and expanding. It's a really useful tool for studying literature. It gives you a way into the text other than, well, here's what I think it means, or I don't know what it means. There are always things you can talk about with cultural studies. I hope this has been useful. Look for more screencasts on different fields of literary criticism and theory in the upcoming weeks and months. And until then, take care, and I hope to see you soon.